So good afternoon. Thank you very much. Use one of that. Okay. Much Akataru Taiko. They're going to take a breather and rest because some of them will be up here in a second. Can you hear me through the microphone? No? Shout louder. Okay, half says yes and half says no. Got it. I'm Audrey Yamagata Noji. Thank you very much for joining us today. Those of you in person, those of you streaming live, and those of you who will view later. Why have this day? Because we can never forget what has happened. The other part is that we need to continuously learn. And we have our own members within our own congregation who have lived through some very horrific, tumultuous times. But they are with us today to educate us, to help us understand. And we want to seize that wonderful opportunity to learn and hear from our own. So we're just going to give you a little bit of background right now about what is EO 9066. So Executive Order 9066 was issued by President Franklin Roosevelt on February 19th, 1942. It essentially granted the Secretary of War the power to, quote, prescribe military areas from which any or all persons may be excluded. Now, the order didn't necessarily specify which groups and which locations, but it ended up only applying to Japanese Americans on the West Coast, which you'll see. So, correct terms to use, because it's important for us to really recognize what really did happen. So, we frequently use the terms internment, but really they were concentration camps, incarceration camps, American concentration camps or prison camps. We talk about being interned, but our folks were really imprisoned and incarcerated. We use the term evacuation and relocated, but in essence, they were forcibly removed, which you will hear and see more about. So chronology. So we'll start back a ways to 1922, where the U.S. Supreme Court denies naturalization right to Japanese immigrants. So you have to get in touch with what was really going on in our world and in our nation at that time. In November of 1941, there was a Munson report that was sent forward to the President and Secretary of State, but it basically said that Japanese Americans have a high degree of loyalty to the United States. That was in November. But in December 7th, the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese from Japan. The next day, December 8th, 1941, Nisei, who the American born in the U.S., so a little backtrack. Issei are the first generation that would have been my grandparents who were born in Hawaii and Japan and immigrated here. My parents, who were both born here, are Nisei, or second generation. But it's really the first generation born here, but we count it as second generation. So counting in Japanese, ichi for Issei, ni, number 2 for Nisei, san, 3, sansei. So I'm sansei, or yonsei, fourth generation, or gosei. So let's just see here. I know we don't have any Issei. Who's a Nisei that's here with us today? Okay. A sansei? What about a yonsei? Excellent. Or gosei? We've got lots of generations with Amy today. That's wonderful. Okay, so moving on. On February 19th, 1942, the EO 9066, or the executive order, again, authorized the military to exclude persons from military areas without trials or hearings. So no deportation hearings, no anything. No gather the evidence and let's give you a fair trial. By March 2nd, 1942, the Western Defense Command proclaims California, Oregon, and Washington as military areas. And what they note as voluntary evacuation begins. So it's like if some of you want to leave, you can. But a little bit later, March 18th, 1942, EO 9102, another executive order, established the WRA, or the War Relocation Authority. And they were to operate these detention camps. That's what they were called at that time. Then a week later, March 24th, the first civilian exclusion orders were issued by the Western Defense Command. Those signs greeted you when you came in today. By June 5th, 1942, there was a completion of forced removal of all Japanese Americans from the Pacific coast to what's called assembly centers. Assembly centers were not the concentration camps. Locally, does anybody know the two main ones in this area? The Pomona Fairgrounds, or kind of makes it sound nice because the fair is going on now, or Santa Anita Racetrack. So where did people stay? They didn't have hotels or dorms. They stayed in the stalls. They stayed in the horse stalls. And so that started happening by June 5th. So things moved very quickly. So by October 30th, removal of Japanese Americans from the assembly centers to concentration camps were completed. So essentially, the assembly centers were shut down and everybody had moved to one of 10 concentration camps in the U.S. By January of 1943, the all-Nisei 442nd Regimental Combat Team was announced. So think of this. You have Japanese Americans who were sent away to camps, who were American citizens, who then joined the military to represent the United States. June 21st, 1942, there was a Supreme Court case, Hirabayashi versus the United States. It upheld the constitutionality to use racial criteria for exclusion. By December 17th, 1944, so we jumped forward now, military exclusion orders were lifted. By December 18th, the Korematsu case was heard. It upheld the constitutionality of the exclusion process. This is the famous Coram Nobis case. By March 20th of 1946, the last camp, Tule Lake, was closed. So things happened very, very quickly. All of a sudden, these camps popped up, and you'll see where they're located. Here's a little video
On December 7th,
introduction.
1941, the Empire of Japan launched an attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. In the following months, hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans were rounded up and sent to internment camps under suspicion of disloyalty to the United States. But the feelings that paved the road to internment began long before the attack. For more than 80 years, Asian immigrants were viewed as economic threats, spurring various laws that effectively banned them from the country. For those who made it to America, the lingering resentment culminated after Pearl Harbor. Motivated by vocal outcries from politicians and military officials, FDR signed Executive Order 9066, empowering the U.S. Army to designate areas from which any or all persons may be excluded. He later formed the War Relocation Authority to establish 10 permanent camps, housing nearly 120,000 Japanese Americans, mostly from the western United States. 2/3 of those interned were native-born American citizens. With only 6 days to dispose of their possessions, residents were forced to sell their belongings and even their homes for small sums of money. Internment camps were often situated in isolated deserts, prone to harsh weather, and surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Within the barracks, internees lived in small one-room apartments with little privacy and constant surveillance. They were only given a standard army cot, blankets, and a small heating stove. Despite these difficult living conditions, internees tried to establish a sense of community, creating newspapers, schools, churches, and farms. Even in the face of persecution, young men came forth to join the military. Nearly 33,000 Japanese Americans served during World War II, many of whom became highly decorated for their valor in battle. Yet as the war continued, public opinion worsened against Japanese Americans. Only 35% of the country thought they should be allowed home once the war was over. This sentiment kept the camps open for over 3 years. On December 17, 1944, the government announced that Japanese American evacuees could return to their homes. When they did return, they found their homes looted and their possessions gone. With work almost impossible to come by, many fell homeless and destitute. At the time, the federal government offered no assistance for those attempting to rebuild their lives. It would take over 40 years before President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, paying reparations to each victim of internment.
No payment can make up for those lost years. So what is most important in this bill has less to do with property than with honor. For here we admit a wrong. Here we reaffirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law.
USS Enterprise had proven her steel at the Battle of Midway. But the Big E is about to face her greatest challenge.
So, what would you do if this happened? You're living in Long Beach or Southern California. What would you do if this, would you resist? If you were told to pack everything up you could carry, what would you take? That was the size of the suitcases then. What belongings would you put in there? What would you do with what you left behind? How do you decide anything? You don't even have time to plan. So many folks were faced with such difficult decisions to make. And once you get there, you're in a foreign place. It could be freezing cold or sweltering hot. Nothing's familiar. You don't even know where you are. Your whole family is upended. Sometimes you're not even together because family members were taken to different camps, different detention centers, different states. How do you even organize your life and pick back up again? So we're going to see another clip about some of the things that happened in the camps, especially with children. Over 100,000 had to leave. Dorothea Lange worked for the WRA. She photographed Japanese Americans as they had to register. She photographed children in their neighborhoods. She recorded children waiting to be shipped to internment camps. As the trains rumbled away, she photographed their tearful goodbyes. She documented living conditions in Manzanar. The camp was isolated, fenced, and guarded. She saw the efforts to keep life normal. She photographed the work the attorneys did for the War Department. She documented the lives that ended during the incarceration. She photographed the college students whose lives were placed on hold. Her work and that of other WRA photographers was withheld from the public during World War II. After the war, Lang's photos were accessioned by the National Archives. You can explore her work from their catalogs. So where were these camps? So we'll have a map that will show you, a little hard to see, but essentially you have the West Coast, so you have 2 camps in California. You have Poston that had 3 essential camps as part of Poston and Gila River. You had Topaz in Utah, Minidoka in Idaho, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Amache in Colorado, Jerome and Roar in Arkansas. So what was the reasoning behind these locations? There's not a lot of credible evidence as to how this all happened. So here are the 10 camps. We'll give you a list of them. And the dates that they opened. So Manzanar opened first, March 21st, 1942, in California, over 10,000. Now, who went there? It was fairly random, but mostly from Los Angeles, the San Fernando Valley, and Bainbridge, Washington. They were sent because they needed to get them away from the coast of Washington, separated them and sent them to Manzanar. May 8th, Poston had camps 1, 2, and 3 in Arizona, with 17,814 coming from Southern California, Kern County, Fresno, Monterey, Sacramento areas. Next was Tule Lake, northernmost section, Siskiyous area, 18,789 in California, mostly coming from Sacramento, Oregon, and Washington. Gila River in Arizona, 13,348, mostly from Sacramento, Fresno, and LA. August 10th, Minidoka, Idaho, with folks coming from Washington and Oregon, over 9,000. Heart Mountain, Wyoming also opened in August with over 10,000 coming from the LA area, Santa Clara County, Washington State. Also in August, Amache in Colorado opened a smaller camp, but still over 7,000, where folks were brought in from Northern California, Sacramento, and LA. You see LA folks, or the LA region, were taken all over the place, mostly just to disperse. September, Topaz, Utah opened, most of the folks from San Francisco. Roar in Arkansas from LA and the Stockton area. In October, Jerome, Arkansas opened with over 8,000 who came from the San Joaquin Valley and the San Pedro area. So you try to make some sense out of where they were in, but look at those numbers. It's staggering. Over 110,000, 60% of whom were American citizens. So here's a map, kind of a colorful map of the U.S., and I tried to throw in where the camps were, because some states were skipped. But if we look at the next slide, you will see that, oh, it moved a little bit. But from LA to Heart Mountain was the route my mother took. From Long Beach to Roar, Arkansas was the route my father took. So if we look at the next slide, you'll see this was a bus after they took the train ride that my mother got in, and it says Cody, Wyoming, because that's where they were going. And then when they got off the bus. Now, a lot of photos showed people smiling and very dressed up. You didn't know where you were going, and you certainly wanted a favorable impression because you're just not sure what's going to happen next, and you want to take your best clothes with you. So that was how she was dressed. Why are so many people smiling? Some of the photographers said smile. So you smiled. You weren't happy about anything, so it's a little bit deceiving. So today's panelists, we're going to have them carefully make their way forward to our presentation table here. We have Joyce Okazaki, who was at Manzanar, Amy Tsubokawa, who was at Poston, Victor Fukuhara, who was at Minidoka, Katsu Izumi at Gila River, and Hatsune Izumi, who was in Topaz. So we're going to give time for our panelists to make their way forward up here. And so Hatsune and Katz and Amy and Joyce and Vic. Just take your time and be careful. Jonas, you want to help get folks up? So while they're coming forward, I'm going to share with you my grandmother was born in Hilo, so she did know how to write English. And she practiced in this ledger, this original ledger, writing to people. They were in Long Beach. They owned the Yamagata Market. And she wrote this from the Jerome Relocation Center in Denton, Arkansas. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Woodruff, how's my dearest friends? I hope everything is fine. I would sure like to see you folks. We are all fine. Charlie is back with us. My grandfather changed his name from Nobuichi to Charlie. However, the FBI had taken him as he and Kimi Sugiyama's husband were trying to start the Japanese language school in Long Beach, and so they saw their writing and assumed they were enemy aliens. Helen married a boy in the Army, her daughter, my aunt. They live in Little Rock, Arkansas. She went from the Santa Anita Assembly Center in August. We came here October 13th, busy making chairs and tables, sewing by hand, cleaning. Charlie and George is working. George would be my father. Looks like we're going to have cold weather. When we left Long Beach, we sold things very cheaply, and we had to pay for everything we owed. We only brought suitcases. When we came to Santa Anita, what I still need is in the government warehouse. We must buy things here. We have to get some more food. I do need money very badly. Please put the money, if you can, please send it to me. Put it in the bank. My grandmother and grandfather gave people credit at the market to buy things, and she needed to collect. So I can credit your books. Please write to me a little more often and let me know how things are in Long Beach. Mrs. Woodruff, do you still go to the show like you used to? The movies. I would like to see this show very much. No fun to be in here. I am trying to learn to write so I could write to you more often. Take good care of yourself. Please write to me. Waiting. Give my love to your daughter. So this is something my grandmother would write to her customers back here in Long Beach from Arkansas after coming to the U.S. from Hawaii. So I'm going to ask our panelists questions in just a second. You know what? Let me do one thing. If you want to advance a slide, Harold. So you're going to know and meet more about Joyce Okazaki and her story about Manzanar. Next slide. She's going to tell you more about Born Free and Equal. You're going to meet Amy Tsubukawa. Next slide. And the film that she and her daughter, Patty Tsubukawa Reeves, were a part of. Next. Vic is our sensei for the Taiko group, but he also has established an incredible museum at the Long Beach Japanese Cultural Center. Here's a photo of him showing others, and then you'll see how he has built tags, replica like the ones you were given today for the various camps. And did my picture disappear? Well, it was there earlier, my picture of cats and Hatsune Izumi. So go ahead, Harold. And I think that may be the last slide. Yes. So here we have our panel, and I am going to ask them a few questions. And I'd like to start with Hatsune and cats and ask you, what was the first thing you remember about being told you had to pack up and leave?
Well, 1942, I was 12 years old, born and raised in Half Moon Bay, California. I don't know where, if you know where that is, but we were, it was during the Depression. We were struggling farmers. I believe I was in about the 5th grade. And I didn't have any Japanese friends because in Half Moon Bay there were only about 4 or 5 Japanese families. My friends were mainly Italian, and they were very outgoing and outspoken, so I learned to become like them, outspoken. And
That's where it comes from, the Italian side.
I beg your pardon?
It came from your Italian side.
Yeah. My neighbors were Italian, and I love Italian food. But we were struggling farmers. Of course, it was during the Depression. And my mother and father didn't know anything about birth control, so they had 10 children. And I guess my oldest brother, I never knew him. And so, but even though we grew up during the Depression, we always had plenty to eat because we were on a farm. We had chickens and rabbits, and my mother and father they were from Japan, educated, Aichiken, and they first settled in San Francisco, and they had an embroidery shop, but times were tough, so they moved to Half Moon Bay. I guess many of you don't even know where Half Moon Bay is. It's a farming and fishing community, and they knew very little about farming, and but they ended up being farmers. And
So here you are, 12 years old.
I'm sorry, I'm a little hard of hearing, so.
You're 12 years old, and your family's farming.
Uh-huh.
And what's the first thing you remember when you were told you had to pack up and leave?
Well, it was a very frightening experience because we were peaceful farmers, and we had to pack up, and we were allowed to take only one suitcase. So what my mother did was she made duffel bags for us, so we could pack a lot more in a duffel bag than you can in a suitcase. So first we were incarcerated in Tanforan. I don't know if you know where Tanforan is, but it's a racetrack. And since we were a large family, they built barracks for us. But the smaller unit families lived in the horse stables that were whitewashed. What an outrage to be living in a horse stable. But we were fortunate enough to be living in the barracks with open roofs, you know, very crude buildings, tar paper buildings, and we were all crowded. We had 3 rooms. Now, I come from a large family, so we were pretty crowded in that barrack. And you could hear the neighbors because it had an open ceiling.
So after, how long, where did you go then? After you were at Tanforan,
After Tanforan,
did they put you on a train or a bus?
they put us on a train. My first train ride. What
First
an
train ride.
experience. And we were,
What did they tell? Where did they tell you were going?
they told us that we were going to Topaz. Now, Topaz is a beautiful stone, but when we got to Topaz, Utah, there was no beautiful stone. It was in the middle of the Sevier Desert, sagebrush, greasewood, and having come from a farm with a lot of greenery, it was a real life-changing experience, I tell you.
Right.
The only thing that saved me, because I was still a teenager, was all the many wonderful friends that I made. In Half Moon Bay, there were only a few Japanese families, but in Topaz,
That's all you
nothing but
had.
Nisei, second generation Nisei. So as a child, I thought it was wonderful. But when I thought about it later on, you know, where was our civil rights, you know? But at that time, we made the best of it, and we did well in school, and our instructors were Niseis, very good instructors, and that was a switch from Half Moon Bay. So,
Okay, thank you. Let's hear from Katz. So Katz, where were you? Thank you, Hatsune.
What was the question?
So where were you? Where were you living?
I was living over here in Terminal Island. There's a fishing village, about 2,500 Japanese. All the males were fishermen and the mothers were cannery workers. And the 9066 was second for us because we were told to get off the island in early March, and we were given 2 days' notice to get off the island. And everyone was panicked because all the Issei's, the males, were taken into jail December the 7th. The night of December 7th, I remember the FBI came to the house and they took my dad, and that was it. But the stores were closed, and the soldiers were patrolling the streets, and for a month and a half now, we couldn't go to school because the ferry was shut down. And they gave us 2 days' notice to pack up. And fortunately for friends all living off the island, everybody cleared out. And we went to LA to my sister's place, and then we got notice to go to another racetrack over there in Tulare, which is just located south of Fresno. And from there on, after a few months there, we went to Gila River, Arizona.
So when December 7th, and they took your father away, how old were you and what were you thinking and feeling?
I was 13, and I didn't even know where Pearl Harbor was, to tell you the truth. And when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, I had to ask my friends, where's Pearl Harbor? Because I had no idea where it was. And that was a fishing communities that we had a typical Japanese village. We had kendo and judo and Japanese school and everything, and then we went to a regular grammar school. I went 1 year to a junior high school over in San Pedro, mainland, called Dana Junior High School, and that's all I remember about Terminal Island. It
So
was
when
a fun
you-
place to live.
When you first got to Arizona, what did you think? What did you notice? How
Well,
did you
we
feel?
came on a bus, I remember, and it was real dusty, and they had little channels all around the barracks, and we were wondering what it was for. And then we realized that when it rains, the rain gushes into those things, and everybody had to jump over those things, but it was real dusty and hot, and cold in the winter.
Sure. Okay.
That's what I remember. We had barracks separated into four units. The A and the D units were larger. The two in the middle were for bachelors and couples. And we were living on D, and our address was 633D, which is the block, the barrack, and the room number.
Why do you think you still remember that?
Why
till
do I
today?
still remember that? Oh, I don't know. I just, in my brain, it's brainwashed in there now. I can't get it out.
I think most folks who were locked up in these camps remember everything about their
yeah.
block and number.
Yeah. Oh, I'm older than these people here, so I think I remember more or.
Okay.
But camp days were kind of fun for me because being a teenager, you kind of rolled with the punch, and I didn't know anything about civil rights or anything like that, and made a lot of friends and had a lot of fun.
When did it first come to you that something was really wrong?
What was wrong?
When did you first start to think about what had been done to you and the other Japanese was wrong?
Well, I really don't know. I guess when I left camp, went to Detroit, Michigan to go to high school, and coming back, I think I kind of felt uneasy because they still didn't want us back to the West Coast. And
Right. So after going from Terminal Island to Tulare to Arizona, you went to Detroit, Michigan.
the what?
You went to Detroit?
I went to Detroit, and then I went to Denver, Colorado, and I graduated in Denver, Colorado.
And that was because you still weren't welcome back to the West Coast.
Yeah. Even in Denver, by my high school teacher helped me get into USC. So I came back that summer, and I still kind of felt uneasy. And right before the enrollment into SC, they sent me a letter saying that I couldn't be enrolled because I was lacking a certain trigonometry course. And so all that time I wasted in the summertime, I could have taken the course I wasted. And so I applied to LA City College, and I spent my 2 years there. But it was a blessing in disguise because I was going into engineering school, and then I went to City College, and I hung around with a bunch of fellows that were all in pre-med and pre-dental and pre-optometry and pre-pharmacy, and we kind of got together, and I applied to dental school, and I got accepted. So it was kind of a blessing in disguise. I didn't become an engineer, but you know.
So, Dr. Izumi, you practiced dentistry for how many years?
I practiced dentistry for 35 years.
Right here in Long Beach.
Yeah, right here on Willow and Pine Avenue.
Thank you.
Willow and Pine Avenue. I was next door originally with Dr. John Kashibara. I think everyone knows his name. And 35 years.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Long time.
So we're going to ask Joyce Okazaki at the other end. Tell us a little bit about your memories of Manzanar, of getting photographed by Ansel Adams, and your experiences. And you have a microphone there.
Well, that was the most memorable thing of being photographed by Ansel Adams. He wanted to do something for the war effort, and he was too old for military service. And so he asked his friend, who was the director of Manzanar, Ralph Merritt, if he could do something. And Mr. Merritt suggested that he come to Manzanar and photograph people living their everyday lives. And so he did. And this was at his own expense. He came, and what I remember of him is he drove one of those wooden paneled station wagons, and he used that to set up his camera. And of course, he took portraits of our family. I don't know why we were chosen, but we were very fortunate because he took my mother and my sister and myself, our pictures, standing outside of the barrack. So the background is tar paper. And I remember that he used this big box camera, and we had to stay still while he was changing the different things that go into the camera. And in the meantime, I complained about the sun hitting my eye. And of course, he didn't say anything. He just made me keep quiet and stay still. And then he took the picture. But my father's picture was not taken. My father was away on a work furlough picking potatoes in Idaho. And, I never asked him why he did that, although I should have later on, but it never occurred to me because, we never talked about camp in our dinner table or anything. So, that was it.
So Joyce, where was your family living before you were taken away?
Well, we were living in Boyle Heights, 2958 East 2nd Street on top of the hill. Right on the bottom of the hill was Evergreen, and then there was an Evergreen Baptist church on the corner. That's where we lived, and of course, it was a rental, so they didn't lose anything. But our next door neighbors they owned their own house, and so when we had to move, and it was a forced removal. People nowadays call it evacuation or relocation, but the correct terminology to reflect what happened to us is forced removal. And that long instruction sheet, well, apparently my parents, because we went to camp before that sheet was issued, they must have heard somewhere along the line that they could have the government store their furniture and big items. And so as long as, I guess, you accepted the knowledge that you're liable for your own, all the storage items. And so what my parents had done was the government actually picked up their furniture, and they had packed away their dishes and pots and pans into boxes, and they had picked all those up, and they took them to storage. And I think the storage was my grandfather's storefront's basement. Now, my grandfather was a man of wealth. He was a businessman who knew how to make money. And so he had this property, which was across from City Hall on Main Street, and he had a dry goods store there. And so when he was arrested the night of December 7th and taken to San Pedro Federal Prison, and on December 16th of 1941, he was then taken to Missoula, Montana. Imagine going from Southern California to Missoula, Montana, and he was like 60 years old or 61 years old. So the temperature change in the weather is just, and I never asked him anything either. And he spoke English, and I never asked him anything because we never talked about camp.
Thank you. We'll ask you some more questions. Speaking about never talking about things, Amy, why don't you tell us where were you living and what happened with where you went to, and why do you think it wasn't talked about? Oh,
Yes, we lived in Long Beach. You talking?
go ahead. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
we lived
Sorry,
in Long
we're going to have
Beach.
Vic answer.
Yeah, and actually on Del Amo and Long Beach Boulevard. And then on December 7th, my father actually worked for a nursery, and he delivered the plants he was a host on nursery, and he delivered plants to the retail stores. And December 7th was my first birthday. And as we celebrating my birthday, we're waiting for my father to come home. So, and 12 o'clock, he never showed up. So we went ahead and did the birthday party. And then we found out he was arrested because he was Japanese, basically driving a truck on the highway. Well, anyway, he finally came home, and then we heard about the internment. So he went up to Santa Barbara, where he was born. And then he didn't realize they're going up the coast, and they were coming up to Santa Barbara. And then he kept going north because my mother was born in Portland, Oregon. And at Portland, Oregon, they start coming. So he went inland to Idaho, which my auntie had a Chinese restaurant there, and thought they couldn't take care of us. Well, he couldn't find a job, and believe it or not, he went into the camp at Minidoka. And he was lucky because he had some belongings, more than a suitcase full of clothes, and he had a car. Well, they took the car away right away, and then they put him in Block 1 and Barracks 12. And then one of the things my mother would say, it was so cold and so dusty, because it was in late July, we ended up there, and the wind would blow, the dust would come up the floor, and actually, when you wake up in the morning, there'll be a silhouette of you laying on the mattress. Well, I slept on the floor for most of the time because we only had 2 cots, one for my mother, one for my father, and there was 3 of us, and then my sister was born about a year later. And then my brother was born just as we were leaving, but because he was so young, we couldn't leave. We had to stay there about a week later, and then we ended up in Los Angeles. But my father and mother my mother would talk about it. My father would not say a thing about camp. And I asked them, why'd you go? Why'd you go in there? And they use this word called shogunai. It can't be helped. You just do what they tell you to do. And my mother would talk about, my father volunteered to be a cook because you get an extra $1 a month or something. And my mother worked in the laundry. And I would run around in the laundry room, and they can't find me half the time because they had a dog at camp, and that was the dog liked me, and he played around with me. But then, that's all I remember about camp because I was only 1 year old. But then I remember a lot of things what happened when we came back because we couldn't find a place to live. Nobody would let us live in their neighborhood. And we ended up in a garage where the lady let us live in her garage. The thing was there was no electricity, no running water, and the lady would bring a lamp cord across and put a little light bulb up there. She did let us use her bathroom in the front house. But we lived there for about 6 months, and then my father, he bought a lawnmower for 50 cents and was going around the neighborhood mowing lawns. He did that for 30 years, mowing lawns, and we ended up buying our own home finally. But it was rough. But You know, my parents would never blame anybody. They just said, shogunai, had to be done.
That Shigata Ganai is something that's been long talked about in Japanese culture about did we just give in or was it just a fatalism? But it was a true belief that you just have to accept it but persevere at the same time. So your dad bought a lawnmower and started mowing lawns, and that stayed in the family for a long time because that's still your business.
I think he was charging 10 cents a lawn. Yeah. But one of the things my father always said to me, he says, when you grow up, graduate high school, college, you go into the Army and fight for this country, America. And he was in concentration camp being and losing everything. He lost everything he had. When he came back, his house was gone. And it was actually, he was playing mortgage while he was in camp, and he ran out of money. And then when he came back, the property where he had his house and neighbors was a parking lot. And if you know North Long Beach there, that was Dooley's parking lot. But the only regret I have is my father buried his samurai sword, his personal belongings that brought back from, you know, I'm supposed to have got the samurai sword because I'm the oldest. And it was like, I don't know how many generations, but it was one of those sacred things, and he buried it, and it's under that parking lot, I think. Maybe.
One night you're going to see Vic out there with a crew digging up the parking lot to get the samurai sword. Thank you very much, Victor. Great job. So, Amy, tell us your history, your story. Oh, you use the microphone.
Oh, that's I should know that. Did I turn it up? I'll use this one. Okay, my story is probably a little bit different, though I think Hatsune and I have about the same background. My father was a farmer, and he intentionally married my mother because she was American-born, and she was bilingual. And this is important to know because as farmers and everybody else, if you had to sign a lease paper, you had to have somebody who could read and write. And my mother had graduated from high school, so she was the right person for him. Our story is different because we had lived in an extended family situation. My father came from Japan on a boat with his two other brothers, and so the three of them stuck together as long as they could economically. And so one of the brothers happened to say, I've had enough of this extended family business. I'm going to go and farm in San Jacinto and become onion farmers. And so my father was left to manage this 60-acre farm in El Monte, California. And the reason why I say that is because his older brother died. So now he was in charge of taking care of 4 adult children from the older brother and 5 of his own children. And so he ran the farm, and we had lived next to a fertilizer storage facility, and then next to them was a dairy farm, and the San Gabriel River was where our playground was oftentimes. And so the background is that when the war broke out, December 7th to the time when we actually went into camp was May 5. And at that time, it was probably the most scariest time in anybody's life, because my father was considered a leader for the San Gabriel Valley Farmers Group, and every Saturday night, the men from the surrounding areas would come to our house because we had a big kitchen and tables to seat them, and they would be served by my aunt, who was an excellent, excellent baker and cook, and she would serve them her home brewed sake, and she would make them some manju that she steamed during the day with rice crackers. And so the men were just delighted to come to our house to talk over about their travails as well as the daily news and about their family. And so they formed this association where my father was suspect. And the one thing that I do remember very, very clearly was when the FBI came to ransack both my auntie's house and our house to find if we had shortwave radios, flashlights, anything important that would make us spies. They considered my father a rabble-rouser, and so they wanted, but he was saved from going into, be taken away to the camps where the men were taken to if they were suspect leaders, because he was very outspoken and said, wait a minute, I have to take care of 9 children and I am ill, so you can't take me. And you know, they didn't take him. They took away the shortwave radio though. And they told us to dump all of the flashlights and instruments that might be conceived as dangerous, like guns, which we didn't have anyway. But so that was the situation. Another incident that I remember between the December 7th and May 5th when we were taken away was when my father took me to grocery shopping. At least I could read, and he couldn't. And so we would look at the labels, and when we came out, we saw all those posters that was nailed onto the telephone poles where it said that we had to leave. And that was the first time I thought my father was afraid. And he said, let's go home quickly. And we did. But he made me read the Executive Order 9066 to him, and so he understood exactly where we stood. And so, again, he spoke out and said, okay, they told us we had to go to Pomona Fairgrounds. And my father said, no, we're not going to go to Pomona Fairgrounds because we needed to provide our own transportation to get there. And our neighbor said he could only drive us to Santa Anita. So we ended up in Santa Anita. And it really helped that my mother was bilingual because she could interpret whatever they were saying to him, and then he would make up his own mind. When we got to Santa Anita, like it was told, that our family was too big. We couldn't stay in the stables because 9 children and all these adults just can't fit into the stables. So we were very lucky. We got to stay in the newly built barracks. And that's where we stayed until we were told that we had to go to Poston, Arizona. No. We were told we had to go to Heart Mountain, Wyoming. And my father said, wait a minute, I'm too ill. And they said, what's wrong with you? And he said, I have a kidney disease, and I will not be able to withstand that cold winter in Heart Mountain. And so they said, well, where do you want to go then? He says, well, I think I'll take a warmer climate. And they said, okay, you're going to Poston, Arizona. It's nice and warm over there. And so That's where we ended up, and we were considered the only group in Poston, Arizona that were called volunteers. We were a family that volunteered to go to that hot desert area. And so you'd be surprised too that, to make a long story short, the first year was a very, very difficult year for all of us, because in October, we were just getting into the colder mornings and nights, and it was cold. And then in the summertime, it's extremely hot. 106 degrees was the natural. And so we had to learn to survive, and we had to organize ourselves. And my father was failing in health, but that's the way things were. Did you have any questions?
So you had mentioned before that your family just didn't talk about it a lot.
Oh, no, that was one thing that was throughout all of our families. Our parents did not talk of frightful things to the children, because we were not privy to adult conversations, actually. And so as youngsters, we were not always aware of what was happening to us. We just obeyed. Whatever they said, we do. And that's just the way it was.
So for all of you, when you think back, well, Victor was only one, but you were probably 3 by the time you left. What do you remember the most? When you have like a flashback or you think about something, what kind of pops into your mind? Are there still things from those days in camp that you remember? I remember Hatsune shared with us once when we had a big food line in the fellowship hall, how she didn't want to stand in line because it reminded her. But other memories, other things that happen in your daily life that you kind of reflect about, other memories that you have of being in the camp.
I remember going to school. And, you know, as youngsters, that was what we had to do. And it was a long time, and this is Arizona. And being in school in the hot weather was difficult. And so we were very lucky because we were on the Indian reservation. And the Indians were very, very kind to us. They says, "Get all the men folks, we're going to teach you how to make adobe bricks." And that's what they did. And they built a school made out of adobe bricks so that the children will not have to suffer in the hot weather. And so I remember school simply because it was a haven. It was something for us to do and keep our minds occupied. And when you do that, and you were kind of happy, and you also had people or children who were the same age as you were, and we had the same interests. And so we got to play, and we didn't have to go and pick weeds like we did when we were on the farm. And we had to just be who we were as youngsters. And we had, at the very beginning, we had Japanese teachers. They were high school graduates or those who were going to college, and that's who our teachers were, and they were excellent. However, later on, we got Caucasian teachers, and we said, "Why are you here?" And they said, "We volunteered to go to teach the Indian children," because that's what the government did, was to give you, these Caucasian ladies and men were given scholarships enough to come to Arizona and teach the youngsters. And they said, but right now, this year, you have a choice. You could teach the Indian children, or you could teach the Japanese children. And so we got some Caucasian teachers, and they were so appalled at how inward we had been thinking at that time. Let me tell you about a teacher called Miss Bertha Starkey.
She was probably my 6th grade teacher, and she said, "What do you mean you don't know how to eat peanut butter jam sandwiches? We never heard of such a thing. None of the classmates ever ate peanut butter jam sandwiches." Well, she had a car. She promptly went to the city of Parker, Arizona, where Poston was. And she went and got every jar of peanut butter and jam and bread that she could find in that city. And she came back, and we had a party the next day. And we had to learn how to eat peanut butter and jam sandwiches. And I thought that was so good because I am still eating peanut butter and jam sandwiches. And I remember her very vividly.
Thank you for that. That was good. Other memories, things. Joyce.
Well, I remember totally differently, of course, just going to eat in the mess hall, because we had to, of course, stand in line to have our meals. But my mother would tell me to take a bite of the food that's served in front of me. Well, we had to go through the cafeteria line to get our food, but I didn't like any of the food that was usually, and so I would sit there for an hour. She would say, "Just take a bite, and then you can go out and play," and I refused to do that.
Do you remember what were some of the food items they served you?
I can't remember, but probably canned beans or canned spinach, which I hated. And the other thing, any of the food that they cooked, I didn't like. I think that's what stunted my growth. Because my sister is a lot taller than me. But the other thing I couldn't eat was squid. It was, I don't know, it was boiled or something, and the insides, they had the insides, that hard thing inside the squid, which should have been removed, but that was all part of the eating, and I refused to eat that. That was just terrible. And so, but it was just about every other day that I didn't like the food that they served.
And you had to walk to the mess hall.
Yes, we had to walk. But the mess hall was in the block, so it's not so bad. School was not within your block, so you had to walk to school. And the other thing I realized, and this is just recently, is my parents both worked. My mother worked at the high school, and she was a PE teacher, and my father worked for the Public Works Department, which was administration, and that was all at the very front of the camp. And we were in Block 12, which was at the very back of the camp, and they had to walk every day to work. And, that's a long distance to walk because they had to walk the 6 blocks.
Right. Thank you. Katz.
I was older than the other people here. So I had a job. Oh, yeah. I had a job in the dairy, and at first we tried to milk the cows, but that was too hard. And later on, we worked on the farm to bale the hay and all that. But I kind of enjoyed it. As a teenager, you kind of adapt to things, and you don't see the bad why you were in camp or anything like that. You've made a lot of good friends, and actually, I had a good time in camp. After camp was something else again, but during camp, I kind of enjoyed it. I got paid $16 a month, and doctors, I think professionals got $19 a month, but we all had free room and board.
Hatsune, do you have certain memories of camp? Things you still come into your mind now?
I'm retired as a speech and language teacher, aphasia. I think I have contacted aphasia. My memory is foggy, but I in my earlier days, I became a civil rights activist. I went to Nevada testing ground to protest, but
You became very active with peace and justice issues.
Yes, I did become very active with the peace and justice because I felt that that's, from my past experience, I would be a good spokesperson. And I also became a civil rights activist. But in my old age, I think I've contacted aphasia. My memory is very foggy, but I'm very proud of CATS has done really well, and I'm very proud of my children. My oldest son is now internal medicine doctor, and my daughter is a social worker, and Kenneth works for the National Institute of Health at Bethesda, Maryland. So I think CATS and I have done well,
Yes.
and I'm very proud of my children.
Great. Thank you.
Now I just sit home and knit because I have arthritis. But
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm
very
really
much.
appreciative of the opportunity to come and speak. So thank you, Audrey.
Sure, sure.
One of the things I remember when I was in camp, and we're in Idaho, and we would call them Hagojin, which is Caucasians, that would come to the camp and they would present like a quilt to my mother and some of the women, and brought us ice cream taffy. It's the first time I've ever ate those, and they're a little white box, and they probably had about 10 pieces in it, and all the children would get it. And this would be about once a month. They would go to the different blocks and take, give those. I don't know if they were Quakers or Mormons or whatever, but they would come to our camp and give the kids candy and the women a quilt. And I thought that was very, and our block 12 was at the end of the line there, and behind us was just a desert, but that was actually Indian reservation, like Amy was saying. And I actually used to play with one of the Indian boys about my same age, and it was hard. But then my father was a cook, but then like Joyce was saying, my father would like sneak at night. There wasn't a guard tower back there because it's where you're going to go from there. And he would crawl underneath the fence and go fishing. And he would bring back, I don't know what kind of fish they were, but he would catch fish, and then he's the cook there, so he'd cook them up, and we'd take them to our barracks, and we had fresh fish. But anyway, it was, my father never spoke bad about the camp. And if he would talk about it, my mother would tell us about the weather. It was so cold in the wintertime and so hot in the summer. That's what they complain more about than anything.
That's right.
Yeah, yeah. And then, of course, the barracks are only made out of the walls. There's no insulation. It's tar paper. It's paper walls. And you think about it, that it's just a thin piece of tar paper, and in the wintertime, in that barracks they give you there's 3 stoves in there for 6 rooms, and it was cold. That's all I remember. It was cold, and when those people would give us those quilts and stuff, I was rolled up like a mummy and still cold. So, but yeah, it was an experience. Yes.
So I know that Joyce has been active at the Manzanar site, and if any of you have had the opportunity driving up 395, Highway 395, you will be able to stop and visit the actual Manzanar historic site. many of the camps now have historic sites and things have been restored, but it took a great deal of work to restore Manzanar. And Joyce has been very instrumental with the Manzanar Committee. And I remember when we toured, because we took a group from the church and we toured Manzanar, they showed us that the boards in the barracks, that they did a display they had a display at Manzanar, but they also had a display at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and all the people who had been incarcerated in the camps said, no, the floorboards are too close together. They're too even. You have to make them crooked and far apart, because that's what we lived with, that it wasn't flat. Initially, there were no mattresses. You had to stuff it with whatever you could. And so it was extremely uncomfortable, but makeshift, because these things had to pop up all over the country all of a sudden, very quickly, with a sense that why should we make it convenient, right? So the food was whatever they cooked up and whatever they got. I have heard that a lot of Japanese put ketchup on everything because of the camp, because they didn't like the way the food tasted, and they didn't have shoyu or soy sauce, so they just put ketchup on everything to disguise the flavor. So I don't know if that's true or not, but I did hear that. But Joyce, tell us about some of the work of the Manzanar Committee and what's happening at the Manzanar sites in case folks want to study this some more. And Vic talked about his dad fishing. There is a movie about the Manzanar Fishing Club. They did the same thing. They snuck out, went fishing, but they came back.
Yeah.
They came back in the camp because they still had to be part of the family and they want to get shot, but they snuck back under the fence with their fish.
Well, there was nowhere else to go, and then
On top of that.
and of course, if you went to any of the neighboring towns, they would just recognize right away that you belong back in Manzanar, and they would immediately, send for somebody to come after you. So there was really no way that we could escape, especially at Manzanar. But the committee has a pilgrimage every year, and it's the last few years it's been virtual. So if you go to Manzanar Committee what is it?
It's probably .com.
No, the nonprofit.
.org.
Yeah, .org. ManzanarCommittee.org, and you will see a very interesting website. They've done a really good job of their website, and you could pull down the shows of the pilgrimage, especially the last 2 or 3 that have been saved. And also there's a booklet that they put on site for this past pilgrimage, which was on April 30th, and that was a very interesting pilgrimage because they had one advantage with having a virtual pilgrimage. You don't have to travel to Manzanar. I could just watch it. I don't have to travel the 250 miles. So I watched it, and it's all very well placed. All the speakers speak one after the other. They take about 5 minutes, and it's just really a very interesting program. And they have taiko performances there. Kyoto Taiko from UCLA performs, and they do a beginning and one in the middle. And then there's an interesting Los Manzaneros or something that they sing about Manzanar, and it's also very interesting. But that is the most recent pilgrimage. Actually, if you go to Manzanar, it's up Highway 395. It's 9 miles north of Lone Pine. And so, when you go, if you ever go to Manzanar and you are a little bit hungry, stop in at Lone Pine and pick up something to eat, because they don't have any food for sale at Manzanar. You can drink water there. There's a water fountain, but I don't think they even have the things that you can, the dispensers where you can buy things. So
There's a little town just north of the Manzanar Historic Site.
Yeah.
Ironically, the name of that town is Independence.
oh yes, that's a good town, but it's even smaller, and it's north. But that's and then the pilgrimage, usually, people want to stay, so we either stayed at Lone Pine or at Independence.
So we have taken our youth there. We also took a whole group from the church just to really experience what it's like and to continue to learn. And they've really done a good job restoring and building some examples of what camp life was like. I want to share a quick story. When we did that trip, there was, at the time, the Eastern Sierra Museum in Independence had a huge collection of Japanese American things, items, pictures, and things like that, that was put together by Mary Nomura, who lived in Garden Grove. And she and her husband, she kind of took their own collection and put it there. So we took the group, and I think it was your aunt that was with us, Joyce, and Mary Nomura, who's a member of our church, different Mary Nomura. They were looking at the pictures in Independence that were there, and Mary says, "Audrey, that's me right there. That's me in that picture." And Joyce's aunt is standing right next to her. She looks at the picture, and they look at each other. They hadn't seen each other since camp, and they were with us on the same trip. It was very chilling to see that and have them connect, because you did make friends. You did meet new people. And so after folks came out of the camps, they would have reunions. And filmmakers and others would go, and it just looked like joyous fun. It's because of the relationships that Katz was talking about. You meet other people. You find a way to continue to survive and get through the hard times. And a lot of parents, including mine, never talked about it because they didn't want us to be hurt. They didn't want us to know about the pain, the agony, the tough times that they went through. So they kept that from us to protect us. When I was first growing up and I heard my parents talk with others, friends and relatives, about camp. "Oh, we knew him in camp," or "Remember in the camp days when we'd do this or that?" I thought you all at some point in your life went to camp, like summer camp. Because of the way it was talked about, I had no idea about what it really meant to be born in America, but because of your background, be taken away without any rights and to lose everything that you had. Not knowing where you're going, not knowing what's going to happen to you. Leaving behind friends and family and businesses and things that had attachment value, and trying to start all over in a very difficult situation, far from home, and then not being able to come back. The history of the original Long Beach Japanese Christian church and the First Grace Presbyterian Church was that it was taken over by others when the community was imprisoned in the camps. The church building itself was taken over, and there had to be a fight to get that back because everything became lost. So Joyce has her book up here, Born Free and Equal. It's pretty good that she's on the cover of a book of pictures from Ansel Adams and his work. So she's a very famous person. But all of our panelists have done a great job. We want to thank you for sharing your stories, your experiences. And And I want to also see if any of you have any questions, and I will attempt to get those.
Audrey?
Yes.
I know that it's been a while, but I remember donating this particular DVD because there's a copy of it in the library. And I brought 4 of them, I believe. And if anybody would like to purchase it and donate it to the Poston Alliance, then you could see my daughter, who, raise your hand. She's got the film. And if you would like to purchase it today, it does tell a good background of what life was like from the beginning to the end of when we became adults.
It's called For the Sake of the Children. Some memories are too painful to remember. Some memories are too important to forget. And it shows Amy and her daughter, and this is available. So thank you for sharing that. There are some very famous people up here. Are there any questions that any of you have, or any comments or things you want to share? Yes. What was church like? Okay, his question, go ahead and repeat it.
What was church like at camp? Did they have church?
Did they have church?
Yes,
in
they
camp?
did. Yes. People, the Japanese people liked to go to church, so they had a Buddhist temple there, and they had to, if there was no Buddhist priest in the camp, they had to get one from outside the camp. They had a Catholic church there. This was in Manzanar. Manzanar was the very first concentration camp to be administered. And so they had a Catholic church, but the priest for the Catholic church drove up from Los Angeles. A Marino missionary priest would drive from Los Angeles every Sunday to say Mass, and his name was Father Lavery, because I used to go to Marino Missionary School, and I knew the father and the 2 sisters. There were 2 Japanese nuns that were at Marino, and they were both in Manzanar. Okay. And then there was a Christian church, which I attended, but I think I was very reluctant in going because it wasn't like, interesting or fun and to hold my interest. But they did have a Christian church, and I think it was a non-denominational Christian church.
I just wanted to add one other aspect of during our incarceration. I come from a very large family, and while we were incarcerated, my brothers, I had 4 older brothers, they were all older. They were drafted from the camp, and what an outrage. My mother was a very active political activist, I guess. She was outraged that they would come in while we were incarcerated and draft 3 of her sons to serve in the United States Army. And it was really devastating for the whole family. So how unjust that was, to be incarcerated and yet asked to serve in the United States Army. And what crime did we commit? We were just Japanese Americans. That was our crime. I just wanted to add that.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Hatsune. That's so important, because there is that whole side about both being drafted as well as just enlisting and serving your country, the United States of America, and even losing your life fighting for your country while your family is locked up. And it is an outrage. There's been a lot of movies and documentaries, as well as some TV episodes that have highlighted this injustice. Other questions or comments? Anybody?
the bottom picture is Joyce, but are the other pictures of the panelists as well? Do we know who's who? And
Okay, so the pictures up here. Victor, are you in the picture? And Katz? Are one of those you in the picture? No? Is your picture in there?
Yeah, right on the lower left.
The lower left. Can't you tell that that's Katz? You could tell because growing up in the church, he looks like the youngest son, Kenneth, in that picture. Okay, and Amy, is that you? On the upper left?
Top left.
Yes, that's Amy. Okay, but that's not you, Victor? The other boy?
That's Ken Tokiyama.
Oh, that's Ken. Is Ken here? Okay, Ken Tokiyama, that's your picture up there, right? Here's our friend Ken. That's your picture up there. So,
I want to ask you a question. In California, there were Manzanar, which was a camp. But up near the Oregon Raider, there's a camp called Tule Lake. What kind of camp was that?
so you want to explain?
No, he's asking, you can explain what Tule Lake was.
You know the answer?
I can't hear it.
Okay, his tag says Gila River, but he was asking about Tule Lake. So Tule Lake was all the way in Siskiyou County, right by the Oregon border. Who was taken to Tule Lake? It was a very large camp, but they had a lot of folks that were taken there that were suspect as well.
You know, it was the question. It was the loyalty questionnaire.
The
that
loyalty question, this is very
everybody
important.
had to answer, and question 27 and 28 were the questions that were really suspect, and 27 asked if you would be willing to serve in the military, and 28 asked if you would forswear allegiance to the Emperor of Japan, and and many of the young men who had gone to Japan, there were, you know, these are the Kibe, who were born in the United States but went to Japan for their education and training, and then came back, and then they were in camps, and they would answer no to those questions. They wouldn't serve in the military, and they would not forswear allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. And so then they would be taken to Tule Lake, and
Right.
they were considered the disloyals.
And this is the term no boys. They answered no to both of those questions, and so they were taken away. So if you track all of this historically, there were times when certain folks were still removed from where they were based on different things that happened. And the no boys answering no to both of those were really ostracized and frequently won't talk about it at all, because there was a great division even amongst the Japanese about how to answer those questions and who should be loyal. And those that were saying, yes, I forswear allegiance to the Emperor of Japan, I'm an American, and they could easily do that, but not everybody believed the same. So families were taken apart, and then within the family, within friends or relatives, they answered differently on those questions. So shame is such a very strong factor for Japanese Americans, and those who stood up and answered no for various reasons were really ostracized, and a lot of them went up to Tule Lake. Yeah.
The other interesting thing that happened at Tule Lake was the United States government passed a rule that they would accept mass renunciations of citizenship. And so about 3,000 people renounced their citizenship all at once. There was about 6,000 people that were no-nos, and this included not only the young men, but some family members, men, mostly the men, and then the women would just follow along with their husbands. And if you even had a question about one of the questions, and you left it blank, or you said maybe or something else, you would automatically be sent to Tule Lake. And so, and then this group of 3,000 people who renounced their citizenship, in order to get it back, the government would not accept a mass acceptance of citizenship. They each had to reapply for citizenship again. And this is where attorney Wayne Collins came in. And he was the only one who was willing to work on that, and it took him about 10 years to get people to get their citizenship reinstated.
There are lots of things to study legally, socially, historically, politically about what happened with this whole incarceration of Japanese Americans, the settlement cases afterwards, the reparations and all of that. You may have noticed this week that former Congressman Norman Mineta passed away, also had been Secretary of Transportation. He was in the picture with President Reagan when Reagan signed the reparations authorization, and there is actually a program at 5 o'clock tonight where the Mineta family is opening up to share their memories and the Mineta Legacy Project, as well as just hear from other folks. So we're so appreciative of our panelists, because it takes a lot to get up here in the first place, but let alone share your innermost feelings and experiences of times that were memorable for various reasons, both some negative things that happen, as well as some things that you try to find the silver lining in, that we all, I think, try to do. I'm going to invite Pastor Jonas up to wrap up our time together and let you know that there's still some photographs and displays, and we do have some light refreshments available in the Ministry Center. But again, thank you once again to our panelists. That was outstanding.
Thank you very much. I'm Pastor Jonas Hayes, Senior Pastor here at Grace First, and I just wanted to say thanks to all who've been involved, our panelists, also our Taiko group who helped open our time together. And also Audrey Yamagata-Noji, who facilitated and put together this whole presentation. Thank you so much, Audrey. And Harold Rivera, kind of behind the scenes, has helped us with the technology, and we're able to live stream this. And it's actually going to be recorded later, so you can actually see this on our YouTube channel. So these stories will be archived, and we can continue to share them. So thank you, Harold, for helping us to do that as well. And then we invite you to join us for fellowship following this event. We have a lot of artifacts in the narthex or the lobby of the church there. We invite you to peruse and take a look at some of those. I know Ken Tokiyama shared with me a handmade drawer set that his father made at camp and that I have in my office. And that's displayed there in the narthex that you can see, and many other artifacts as well. So let's have a time of prayer. I'd like to close this moment with prayer. Let us pray. Most gracious and compassionate God, we thank you for the powerful time that we've had together this afternoon, for the storytelling, these experiences that have been shared. These stories that have been laced with pain and also with experiences of insight and awareness, that we're able to better serve you as disciples. Help us that we would recognize the parallels that happen today, experiences of trauma in people's lives, that we can act differently, that we know the way that these kinds of events have impacted people, children of God, and that we, when we see things that happen in our world today, that we act different, that we stand up for injustice, and that we help people at times of pain and difficulty. We thank you that this gives us an opportunity to respond differently, that we can be people of faith, people of love and compassion. So I thank you so much for these members of our church family and friends that have shared these testimonies and stories, and help us as people of faith that we would respond with love, that we would love one another as you've called us to do. We pray all this